Good evening. Thank you for joining us for tonight's special report from Japan, as we bring you coverage of the first meeting between humanity's guardian angels, the so-called Bells, and a head of state, Japanese Emperor Hirohito. Our local reporter was on the ground as he was granted special access to the event. Though he was unable to be present for the ceremony, he did bring us this eyewitness account from two Japanese captains, Poi and Two Heavens. The account is as follows. Such a momentous event required a great deal of logistics to begin. Firstly, it required military logistics of a scale normally only seen during large-scale exercises or preparing for a major offensive. It also required some very masterful ship handling, quietly aided by the kami who had been chosen to represent the kami of the fleet. Each ship had to be as close to each other, and to the site of the meeting, as was physically possible to allow each kami to be fully present. Then, ramps were carefully constructed to allow the delivery of specially made mikoshi up to the decks of the ships. If the kami were to be taken from their hulls, they must be taken the proper way. The spiritual logistics were another massive endeavor in their own right. Setting aside the mikoshi, Yokosuka Naval Arsenal itself had been prepared carefully by members of the Imperial Household Agency and by Shinto priests. The Navy Yard almost looked like a shrine in its own right now. Grand torii had been erected at the entrances, and all manner of charms and blessings prepared. Everything had to be perfect. The day began with offerings to the god of the sea, the god of fire, the god of war, and a panoply of others, all performed by the most senior priests in Japan. The air was heavy with the scent of burning incense as Miko walked from ship to ship. The young women were bringing offerings, conducting purifying rituals, all while singing songs of praise as they went. Barrels of sacred sake, donated from various shrines across Japan, were piled by the bow of each ship next to the altars where the Miko and priests left their offerings to the kami of the fleet themselves. For what almost resembled a matsuri, a shrine festival, the mood was quite intense instead of cheerful and festive. This was a matter of utmost importance. The Emperor was meeting with his fellow divines formally for the first time. There was a sense of deep anticipation as the procession that would bring the Emperor to the designated place of meeting along the docks approached. As the Imperial party arrived at the docks, two mikoshi arose, as one on the decks of two warships, carried by their crews, and preceded by an honor guard of officers. Even when one would think all eyes would be on the Son of Heaven and the kami, security was tight. Even as the kami departed their bodies of steel and steam, every lookout post was manned, aircraft guarded the skies, and destroyers prowled far out to sea, hunting for any trace of the great enemy. Nothing would interrupt this holy meeting. The two mikoshi come to rest before the maze of silk screens prepared for the meeting, gently being lowered to the ground as the portions of their crews selected to represent their fellows form up behind their officers. Quickly they bow deeply in unison as the Tenno arrives. No longer clad in the military uniforms the Emperor had been seen in recently, he was once again clad in the golden raiment of full sokutai, the formal court dress of the imperial household, looking every bit the divine god-king that ruled over the land of the rising sun, and all that the sun's rays touched. Only once the Tenno had taken his place atop his throne did they straighten back up. They all knew what would come next, they all knew their own kami after all, but still, a part of them strained to see what would happen. The first kami to alight from her mikoshi was an unorthodox choice to many in naval high command. She wasn't a battleship or carrier, but instead a mere support vessel, but none could deny her kami's patriotic fervor. There was no more ardent adherent to the will of the Tenno than Chiyoda. Far from her usual dress, she emerged from her mikoshi in full junihito, carrying a lacquered case that contained a gift for His Imperial Majesty. It would later be reported by the Imperial Household Agency that the gift was a pair of custom-made golf clubs, handcrafted by the kami herself. The next kami, however, was also someone unexpected. A destroyer from her hull, the young woman was fresh-faced and cheery, her beaming smile adding some color back to the proceedings and relieving some of the growing tension. But Kasumi, too, was a warrior, and those who were close enough to see the sword calluses on her hands from rigorous training with the weapon at her hip, even as she radiated her joy to the world around her. As one, the two stepped forward on the carpeted path that had been prepared for them. The position of the wooden platform they would greet the Emperor from had been carefully measured before it had been placed. They slip behind the silk screens to meet with the Son of Heaven at the absolute furthest they could possibly walk from their hulls. A hush falls over the assembled people as the Emperor rises from his throne and follows his own path behind the screens. The meeting of the divines was a sacred one, and not for the eyes or ears of mere mortals. The onlookers instead listen to the traditional music and chanting as the ceremony around them goes on. This place itself was sacred now, not just from the meeting that was occurring, but it was a navy yard. The ships that lived here had always been special, but now their spirits walked alongside mortals. Propriety required certain steps be taken for their sake and the sake of their crews, even the foreigners, or perhaps especially the foreigners. Someone had to teach them how to respect the gods they now served properly, after all. Time passes, with no sign of life among the screens. It was easy to speculate what was being discussed by the gods, but still, the crews kept their silence, as did the imperial household staff, and the combined pressure from these two groups silenced the rest. All there was to do was wait, and enjoy the Miko's songs. An hour passes before the Emperor returns to his throne, and the kami emerge from behind the screens once again. Each woman carries with them an ornate imperial seal, the lacquered wood and the glinting gold shining brightly in the sunlight. The bond between emperor and vassal in physical form. Imperial power made manifest. Each kami would receive their own special seal in the coming weeks. Each kami would pledge her fealty to the chrysanthemum throne personally. These kami, though, were the first, and they slowly returned to their mikoshi with their heads held high. Once the ornate wooden doors of the palanquins of the kami are closed by the sailors attending them, a gesture from the Tenno summons one of the priests, who bows deeply as the Emperor draws a scroll from within his robes, and hands it to the man. The priest keeps his head firmly down to the Emperor, taking a few steps backward before turning and straightening up, unfurling the scroll with a flourish before beginning to read the words the Emperor had written for this occasion. From any other ruler, any other leader, it would have been a grand and inspiring speech. From Emperor Hirohito, it was instead a poem. His Imperial Majesty's talented poetry was well known among the court, and the simple verses spoke of a desire for clear skies, for free seas, and for every heart to hold courage in the face of the demons that now stalked the earth. It was a most moving poem, with some eyes watering, even with some sailors having to translate into numerous other languages for their shipmates. It was not inspiring in the same way that a man screaming with passion might whip up a crowd, but in that moment, all shared the Emperor's dream for peace to return to the world, and all shared the resolution to see through what had been done to win that peace. The order, the mandate of heaven itself, was clear, so far as the common sailor understood it. The security of the home islands, and Japan's most critical lanes of trade, had been secured. The kami, the gods themselves, had re-established their bond with the imperial household. All was as it should be. All was ready. Now with the Emperor's will in their hearts, every captain, kami, officer, and sailor of the Imperial Japanese Navy knew that their time had come. The IJN had defended, as was their duty. Now the Emperor bid them to be Japan's avenging sword, and to cleanse the demons from the seas of this earth. This too was their duty. They had been reacting to the demons. Now they would make the demons react to them. As the Emperor alights into his palanquin to return to the palace, and their kami return to their mikoshi, one bell captain steps forward, and raises their sheathed sword over their head, gaining the attention of every man, woman, and child in the naval yard. The world holds its breath for the moment as the captain centers themselves for a second, and shouts so loudly the gods in heaven could hear. Tenno Haika! The assembled men and women of the Imperial Japanese Navy answer in one voice, Banzai! The crews bow as one, and rush back to their ships, casting off lines and immediately starting to make their way out of port, to the cheers and exultation of their fellows and the civilians present. The Imperial Japanese Navy would commence offensive operations immediately. Thank you for joining us for this special report from Japan. As always, tune in for weekly news from around the world. Good night.